In ancient Rome, bread was not just food, it was currency, it was politics, it was survival. And for those who controlled its production and distribution, it was power, raw, inescapable, and absolute. The average Roman citizen consumed approximately 3 pounds of bread per day, not as a side dish or a luxury, but as the foundation of their diet. Bread provided the calories, the sustenance, the energy required to survive in a crowded, chaotic metropolis of over 1 million people. Meat was expensive. Vegetables were seasonal. Wine was common, but not filling. Bread was everything. This dependency was not accidental. Rome's urban population had grown so rapidly, so explosively, that traditional food production could not keep pace. The city had long since outgrown its agricultural hinterland. Grain had to be imported from Sicily, from North Africa, from Egypt, and distributed through a vast, state-managed system known as the annona. This system, refined over centuries, was designed to ensure that Rome's citizens received their daily rations, that the bakeries had enough flour, and that the urban masses remained fed, calm, and loyal to the emperor.
The annona was a marvel of ancient logistics. Massive grain ships docked at Ostia, Rome's port city, where grain was weighed, recorded, and transported up the Tiber River to warehouses in the capital. From there, it was distributed to licensed bakers, pistores, who ground the grain into flour, baked it into loaves, and sold it to the public. The entire system was regulated by magistrates, overseen by imperial officials, and subsidized by the state. When it worked, it was one of Rome's greatest achievements. When it failed, the city descended into chaos. History had proven this repeatedly. In 22 BC, a grain shortage led to riots so severe that Augustus himself had to intervene, importing emergency supplies at his own expense. In 51 AD, during the reign of Claudius, a food crisis sparked public demonstrations that nearly turned violent. Suetonius recorded that Claudius was trapped in the Forum by an angry mob demanding bread, pelted with stale crusts, and barely escaped with his life. The message was clear: starve Rome, and Rome will burn. Emperors understood this. So did senators, magistrates, and anyone with even a passing knowledge of urban politics. Grain was not just an economic issue, it was a matter of national security. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not a joke, it was policy. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they will tolerate anything. Deprive them of bread, and they will tolerate nothing. But the annona system, for all its sophistication, had a fatal flaw. It relied on bakers.
The pistores were not farmers, not soldiers, not bureaucrats. They were artisans, small business owners, men who owned ovens and mills and operated out of neighborhood shops scattered throughout Rome's 14 districts. They were licensed by the state, but they were not state employees. They were private citizens, responsible for feeding their communities, and they held a position of extraordinary leverage. A neighborhood in Rome typically depended on a handful of bakeries. These were not massive industrial operations. They were small establishments, family-run, with wood-fired ovens that produced dozens of loaves per day. Citizens knew their baker by name. They visited the same shop every morning. They trusted that the bread would be there, that the price would be fair, that the quality would be consistent. This trust was Rome's Achilles heel. Because bakers, uniquely among Roman tradesmen, controlled something irreplaceable. A blacksmith could lose customers if his work was poor. People would go elsewhere. A tavern owner could be undercut by competitors. But a baker? A baker controlled food, and food in a city of 1 million people living in cramped tenements with no kitchens of their own, was not optional. Most Romans could not bake their own bread. They had no ovens, no space, no access to raw grain. They depended entirely on the pastores. And the bakers knew it. This dependency created an environment ripe for exploitation. If a baker raised his prices, what choice did his customers have? If he reduced portion sizes, mixed sawdust into the flour, or sold day-old loaves as fresh, what recourse did the public have? They could complain to magistrates, certainly. They could riot if things got bad enough. But on a day-to-day basis, they had to buy bread. They had no alternative. And slowly, quietly, over the course of decades, some bakers began to realize that this power could be organized, coordinated, and weaponized. They began to talk to one another, to form alliances, to agree on prices, on production limits, on ways to manipulate the system without drawing too much attention. They discovered that if they worked together, if they acted not as competitors but as a unified bloc, they could control entire neighborhoods, influence magistrates, and extract wealth from a population that had no choice but to pay. They became, in every sense of the word, a cartel. And Rome, for all its military might, for all its laws and legions and imperial authority, had no idea what was happening until it was far too late. The transformation of Rome's bakers from honest tradesmen into organized criminals did not happen overnight. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, a slow evolution driven by economic opportunity, social networks, and the inherent flaws of the annona system itself. It began with the Collegium Pistorum, the Bakers' Guild. Roman guilds were common. Nearly every profession had one. Builders, metalworkers, fullers, merchants, all organized into collegia that served as social clubs, mutual aid societies, and professional networks. These guilds were legal, encouraged even, because they helped maintain order. Members supported one another in times of hardship, organized religious festivals, and ensured that their trades maintained certain standards of quality. The Bakers' Guild was no different. Established during the reign of Augustus, it served legitimate purposes, coordinating training for apprentices, setting basic quality standards, providing financial assistance to members whose ovens burned down or whose mills broke. Guild meetings were held regularly, often in temples or public halls, and attended by dozens of pastores from across the city.
But guilds also had a darker potential. They brought competitors together, allowed them to communicate freely, and fostered a sense of collective identity. And when economic pressure mounted, when grain prices fluctuated, when imperial taxes increased, when customers demanded lower prices, the bakers began to see one another not as rivals, but as allies. The first signs of collusion were subtle. A group of bakers in the Subura, Rome's most densely populated district, began meeting informally, separate from the official guild gatherings. They discussed prices. They shared information about grain shipments. They agreed, quietly, that none of them would undercut the others. If one baker charged a certain price, they would all charge the same. If grain became scarce, they would all reduce their daily output simultaneously, creating the illusion of a natural shortage rather than a coordinated restriction. This was not yet criminal. It was simply coordination, but it was the first step. As these informal agreements proved profitable, other bakers took notice. Groups formed in the Escaline, the Aventine, the Campus Martius. Each district developed its own network, its own set of rules, its own unspoken understanding. We control the bread, We set the terms, and the customers will pay what we demand.
The transition from cooperation to collusion to outright cartel behavior was driven by a simple realization. The state could not monitor every bakery. The Annona system regulated grain imports and distributed flour to licensed bakers, but it could not oversee every transaction, every loaf, every oven. Once the flour left the state warehouse, it entered a shadow economy where records were unreliable, inspections were rare, and corruption was easy. Bakers began to exploit this. They falsified production records, claiming they had baked fewer loaves than they actually had, and sold the surplus on the black market at inflated prices. They bribed grain inspectors to overlook discrepancies in flour weights. They colluded with warehouse workers to divert grain directly to private buyers, bypassing the official distribution system entirely. But the most powerful tool in their arsenal was family. Many bakeries were multi-generational enterprises. Fathers passed ovens to sons, brothers worked side by side, cousins apprenticed under uncles. These family networks became the backbone of the cartels. Blood ties ensured loyalty. Marriages between baker families consolidated power. A single extended family could control 3, 4, even 5 bakeries in a single district, effectively monopolizing the bread supply for thousands of residents. And when a family controlled the bread, they controlled the neighborhood. Customers who complained about prices found themselves blacklisted. Rival bakers who refused to join the cartel had their flour deliveries mysteriously delayed. Magistrates who investigated corruption found themselves stonewalled. Bakers claimed ignorance, blamed shortages on poor harvests, and presented falsified records that appeared legitimate. The cartels were not violent, at least not initially. They did not need to be. Their power came not from fear, but from necessity. People needed bread. The bakers had it. And as long as the system remained opaque, as long as the public could not see the coordination happening behind the scenes, the cartels could operate with near impunity. By the mid-2nd century AD, the cartels had evolved into a sophisticated shadow economy. They had networks of informants who reported on grain shipments. They had bribed officials who warned them of upcoming inspections. They had agreed upon price floors that ensured no member of the cartel would undercut the others. They had mechanisms for punishing defectors. Bakers who broke the rules found their ovens sabotaged, their reputations destroyed, their businesses driven into bankruptcy.
And perhaps most importantly, they had legitimacy. To the average Roman, the bakers were still respectable tradesmen. They attended guild meetings, they participated in religious festivals, they maintained the appearance of honest labor. The idea that they were operating a criminal conspiracy, that they were deliberately manipulating the grain supply for profit, seemed absurd. But it was not absurd. It was real, and it was only going to get worse.
The mechanics of the bread cartels were ruthlessly efficient. These were not thugs or street criminals operating through brute force. They were businessmen, artisans who understood logistics, supply chains, and the vulnerabilities of a complex system. They wielded power through coordination, manipulation, and a deep understanding of Rome's dependency on their product. Their methods fell into several categories, each designed to maximize profit while minimizing the risk of exposure. First, sabotage. Ovens were the heart of a bakery. Without a functioning oven, a pister could not bake bread. And ovens, in ancient Rome, were fragile. They were wood-fired, built from brick and clay, and required constant maintenance. A crack in the structure could render the oven useless. A blockage in the ventilation could cause dangerous smoke buildup. A deliberate act of sabotage, a handful of sand mixed into the mortar,
A stone placed in the firebox, a subtle weakening of the foundation, could destroy an oven overnight.
Cartel members used sabotage to eliminate competition. If a baker refused to join the cartel, if he undercut their prices or reported their activities to magistrates, his oven would mysteriously fail. Repairs were expensive and time-consuming. While he was out of business, the cartel would absorb his customers. By the time his oven was repaired, he would have lost his income, his reputation, and his will to resist. These acts were nearly impossible to prove. Ovens failed naturally all the time. Magistrates investigating complaints found themselves facing bakers who shrugged and blamed poor construction, bad luck, or the gods. Without evidence of deliberate tampering, and such evidence was rare, there was nothing to prosecute. Second, price fixing. This was the core of the cartel's power. Through informal agreements, bakers in a given district would set a minimum price for bread. No member of the cartel would sell below this threshold. If grain became scarce, they would all raise their prices simultaneously. If a harvest was abundant and grain was cheap, they would resist lowering prices, pocketing the difference.
Price fixing worked because customers had no alternatives. A Roman living in the Subura could not simply travel to the Esquiline to buy cheaper bread. The distances were too great, the time too valuable. He had to buy from his local bakery, and if all the local bakeries were charging the same inflated price, he had no choice but to pay. The cartels justified these prices by claiming that grain costs had risen, that taxes had increased, that ovens required more fuel. Most customers, lacking access to accurate information about grain shipments or state-subsidized flour, believed these explanations. They grumbled, certainly, they complained, but they paid. Third, bribery. The Annona system relied on officials, grain inspectors, warehouse supervisors, magistrates responsible for overseeing distribution. These men were supposed to ensure that bakers received fair allocations of flour, that scales were accurate, that weights were honest. But they were also poorly paid, overworked, and vulnerable to corruption.
Cartel members bribed them systematically. A few sestertii here, a free loaf of bread there, and suddenly an inspector would overlook discrepancies in a baker's records. Warehouse workers would allow cartel members to purchase extra flour off the books. Magistrates would delay investigations, ignore complaints, or tip off bakers about upcoming inspections. This corruption was endemic and nearly invisible. The officials involved were not stealing massive sums. They were taking small, regular payments that added up over time. And because the system was already complex, already opaque, their complicity went largely unnoticed. Fourth, manipulating quality. Not all bread was created equal. The finest bread, made from pure wheat flour, was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. The cheapest bread, made from barley or mixed grains, was coarse and less nutritious but affordable for the poor. Most Romans consumed something in between, wheat bread of middling quality.
Cartel bakers manipulated this system by mixing low-quality grain into their flour while charging prices for higher-quality bread. They added fillers, ground beans, sawdust, chalk, to stretch their supplies and increase profit margins. They sold day-old bread as fresh. They underbaked loaves to reduce fuel costs, producing bread that was doughy and heavy rather than properly cooked. Customers complained, but what could they do? The alternatives were no better. Every bakery in the district was part of the cartel, and they all used the same tactics. Quality declined across the board, but prices remained high. Fifth, withholding supply. This was the nuclear option, used rarely but to devastating effect. If a neighborhood magistrate began investigating the cartel, if an official threatened to crack down on corruption, the bakers would respond by withholding bread. They would claim their ovens were broken, their flour supply was delayed, their workers were sick. For a few days, the neighborhood would have no bread. Panic would set in immediately. Customers would besiege the magistrate's office, demanding he fix the problem. The magistrate, facing the prospect of a riot, would back down. The investigation would be dropped. The ovens would mysteriously begin working again. And the cartel would continue operating, now more confident than ever that they were untouchable.
Sixth, neighborhood loyalty. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of the cartels was how they cultivated loyalty among the very people they exploited. Bakers were community figures. They knew their customers by name. They extended credit during hard times. They donated bread to local temples and festivals. They positioned themselves as pillars of the neighborhood, men who cared about their community. This made it psychologically difficult for customers to view them as criminals. When prices rose, people blamed the state, the emperor, foreign traders, anyone but the baker standing in front of them, smiling and handing them a loaf. The cartels weaponized this trust, using it as a shield against suspicion and a tool to deflect blame. By the late 2nd century, the bread cartels had perfected their system. They controlled supply, manipulated prices, corrupted officials, and maintained public goodwill, all while extracting enormous profits from a population that had no choice but to participate. They had become, in every meaningful sense, Rome's first organized crime syndicate. And Rome, distracted by wars, political intrigue, and imperial succession crises, had no idea how deep the corruption ran.
The system, for all its corruption, remained stable as long as grain was abundant. But in the early 3rd century AD, that stability began to crumble. Rome's grain supply depended on 3 primary sources: Sicily, North Africa, primarily modern Tunisia and Libya, and Egypt. These regions produced the surplus grain that fed the capital, and their harvests were generally reliable, but they were not invulnerable. Poor weather, political instability, piracy, and war could all disrupt the flow of grain to Rome. And in the years following the death of Commodus in 192 AD, all of these factors converged. The empire descended into civil war. Multiple claimants fought for the throne, and their armies ravaged the countryside, destroying crops and disrupting trade. Severan dynasty emperors stabilized the situation temporarily, but the damage had been done. Grain shipments became erratic. Harvests in North Africa suffered from drought. Pirates operating in the Mediterranean seized cargo ships, and the cartels saw opportunity. When grain supplies tightened, the state increased its purchases, driving up prices. The cartels, with their networks of bribed officials and insider information, knew when shortages were coming before the public did. They hoarded grain, stockpiling it in hidden warehouses and private storage rooms. Then, when the shortages hit and panic set in, they released their hoards gradually, selling at inflated prices. To the average Roman, it appeared that the bakers were struggling just like everyone else, dealing with the same shortages, paying the same high prices for flour. But in reality, the bakers were engineering the crisis, amplifying natural scarcity through artificial restriction. The quality of bread plummeted. Loaves became smaller. The flour was darker, coarser, clearly mixed with inferior grains and fillers. Customers complained, but the bakers shrugged. "There's a shortage," they said. "The grain from Africa hasn't arrived. We're doing the best we can." Urban unrest began to simmer. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, demanding answers.
Why was bread so expensive? Why were the loaves so small? Why did some neighborhoods seem to have bread while others had none?
The answers, when they came, were unsatisfying. Magistrates blamed pirates, droughts, and imperial mismanagement. Bakers blamed the state for not providing enough subsidized flour. Everyone pointed fingers, and no one took responsibility. But some officials were beginning to suspect the truth. A magistrate in the Esquiline district, a man named Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, no relation to the emperor, began investigating complaints about bread prices. He reviewed distribution records, interviewed customers, and compared the official grain allocations to the amount of bread actually being sold. The numbers did not add up. According to state records, the bakers in his district had received enough flour to produce thousands of loaves per day, but the actual amount of bread reaching customers was far lower. Where was the missing flour going? Traianus began asking questions. He visited warehouses, inspected ovens, and demanded to see the bakers' production logs. The bakers, alarmed, responded with evasion. Records were lost. Workers were unavailable. Flour had been spoiled and discarded. Every explanation sounded plausible in isolation, but together they painted a picture of systematic fraud. Other officials began conducting their own investigations. In the Subura, a warehouse supervisor noticed that grain was disappearing from storage faster than the distribution records indicated. In the Aventine, customers reported that certain bakeries seemed to have ample supplies, while others claimed to be out of flour entirely. On the Campus Martius, a magistrate discovered that a group of bakers were related by marriage, cousins, brothers-in-law, uncles, and that their businesses were coordinating prices and production. The evidence was mounting, but evidence alone was not enough. The cartels had spent decades building their networks, bribing officials, and cultivating loyalty. Breaking them would require more than investigations. It would require a direct confrontation with some of Rome's most entrenched and well-connected tradesmen.
And then disaster struck. In 217 AD, a grain fleet from Egypt was destroyed by a storm. Hundreds of ships sank, carrying millions of pounds of grain to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Rome's reserves, already depleted by years of poor harvests and civil war, could not absorb the loss. The Annona system teetered on the brink of collapse. The cartels seized the moment. They stopped producing bread entirely, claiming they had no flour. Neighborhoods descended into chaos. Riots erupted outside bakeries. Magistrates were besieged by desperate crowds. The emperor, Caracalla, faced mounting pressure to act. And finally, Rome struck back. The emperor could tolerate many things: political intrigue, military setbacks, even assassination attempts. But he could not tolerate bread riots. A hungry Rome was a dangerous Rome, and the bread cartels, whether they realized it or not, had pushed the empire to its breaking point. Caracalla, known for his brutality and his paranoia, ordered a comprehensive investigation into the Pistores. He assigned a team of magistrates, backed by the urban cohorts, Rome's police force, to uncover the full extent of the corruption. The message was clear: find the criminals, break the cartels, and restore the grain supply, by any means necessary. The investigations began in earnest in 218 AD, shortly after Caracalla's assassination and the rise of Elagabalus. The new emperor, though young and inexperienced, inherited a city on the verge of starvation and a senate demanding action. He authorized the magistrates to use extraordinary powers: unrestricted access to warehouses, the authority to seize records, and the ability to arrest anyone suspected of collusion. The first raids were surgical. Magistrates targeted warehouses known to be controlled by cartel-affiliated bakers. What they found was damning. Massive stores of grain, hidden behind false walls and buried beneath legitimate supplies. Some warehouses held enough flour to feed entire neighborhoods for weeks, flour that should have been baked and distributed, but was instead being hoarded for black market sales. Arrests followed. Guild leaders were detained, their homes searched, their financial records confiscated. Grain inspectors who had accepted bribes were publicly identified and stripped of their positions. Warehouse supervisors were interrogated, and many confessed under pressure, providing names of bakers who had paid them to falsify records. The scale of the conspiracy stunned even the magistrates conducting the investigation. This was not a handful of corrupt bakers operating independently. It was a network, coordinated, hierarchical, and deeply embedded in the city's infrastructure. Families were involved. Officials were complicit. The cartels had tentacles in every district, every warehouse, every level of the Anona system. Public opinion turned sharply against the bakers. Romans who had once seen their local pistor as a trusted community member now viewed him with suspicion and anger. Graffiti appeared on bakery walls. "Thieves! Starvers of Rome! Death to the bread mafia!" In some neighborhoods, angry crowds vandalized ovens and destroyed equipment, forcing the urban cohorts to intervene. The Senate, sensing the political opportunity, passed a series of emergency measures designed to dismantle the cartels and restore state control over the bread supply. First, mandatory state supervision. All bakers would now be required to submit detailed production reports to magistrates on a weekly basis. These reports would include the amount of flour received, the number of loaves baked, and the prices charged. Discrepancies would trigger immediate inspections. Second, weight and quality standards.
New regulations specify the exact weight and composition of bread sold to the public. Loaves would be inspected randomly, and bakers found selling underweight or adulterated bread would face heavy fines, or, in extreme cases, exile. Third, dissolution of illegal alliances. The Senate declared that any coordination between bakers for the purpose of fixing prices or restricting supply was illegal and punishable by confiscation of property. Guild meetings would be monitored. Family-owned bakeries operating in the same district would be subject to heightened scrutiny. Fourth, punishment of corrupt officials. Grain inspectors, warehouse supervisors, and magistrates found to have accepted bribes were prosecuted publicly. Some were fined. Others were exiled. A few, accused of directly contributing to the bread shortages, were executed. A rare and dramatic demonstration of the state's resolve. The crackdown was swift and brutal. Within months, dozens of bakers had been arrested, their businesses seized, and their assets liquidated. The cartels, which had operated with impunity for decades, found themselves under siege. Some members fled Rome, abandoning their ovens and disappearing into the countryside. Others cooperated with investigators, providing testimony in exchange for leniency.
But the cartels did not go quietly. In some districts, bakers organized work stoppages, refusing to bake bread in protest of the new regulations. They framed the crackdown as government overreach, claiming that the state was punishing honest tradesmen for problems caused by imperial mismanagement. A few even attempted to rally public support, arguing that the new oversight would drive them out of business and leave neighborhoods without bread. The gambit failed. The public, having endured months of shortages and inflated prices, had no sympathy for the bakers. Magistrates responded to the work stoppages by seizing the ovens and hiring new workers, former apprentices, slaves, even soldiers to operate them. The message was clear. Rome did not need the cartels. The cartels needed Rome. By 220 AD, the worst of the crisis had passed. Grain shipments resumed. New bakers, closely monitored by the state, took over the ovens of the convicted. The Annona system, though damaged, was stabilized. The bread supply once again flowed to the neighborhoods. But the scars remained. Rome had learned a harsh lesson, that even in the heart of the empire, even in a city protected by legions and governed by emperors, power could be wielded quietly, invisibly, through control of something as simple as bread. The cartels had been broken, but their methods, their tactics, and their legacy would endure.
The bread cartel crisis was a turning point in Roman history, not because it threatened the empire militarily or politically, but because it exposed a vulnerability that no one had fully appreciated: Rome's dependence on a fragile, easily corrupted food supply. In the aftermath of the crackdown, emperors took unprecedented steps to secure the grain supply. State control over the Annona system increased dramatically. New warehouses were built, directly supervised by imperial officials. Grain shipments were tracked with greater precision. Bakers were subjected to regular inspections, and any hint of collusion was met with immediate investigation. These reforms worked, at least temporarily. Bread prices stabilized. Quality improved. The risk of another cartel forming was reduced, though not eliminated. But the reforms also revealed a deeper problem. Rome had become too large, too complex, too dependent on systems that could be manipulated by those who understood them. The bread cartel scandal influenced later emperors' food policies. Diocletian, in the late 3rd century, implemented his famous Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to control inflation by capping the prices of goods, including bread. The edict was a failure, widely ignored and impossible to enforce, but it reflected the lingering fear that merchants and tradesmen could hold the empire hostage through price manipulation.
The scandal also changed how Romans viewed bakers. Once seen as essential, respectable tradesmen, pastores were now viewed with suspicion. They were powerful, yes, but that power was dangerous. Trust had been broken, and it would not be easily restored. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the bread cartels was what they taught historians about the nature of organized crime. This was not a gang of violent criminals operating in the shadows. It was a network of businessmen using legal structures, guilds, family businesses, trade agreements to engage in illegal activity. They did not murder or terrorize. They simply controlled access to something essential and used that control to extract wealth and influence. In this sense, the bread cartels were Rome's first true mafia. They operated through coordination, not coercion. They relied on corruption, not violence. They built power through networks, not armies. And they nearly brought the capital of the empire to its knees, not with swords, but with flour. Modern historians have studied the bread cartel crisis as a case study in how societies become vulnerable to economic manipulation. The same dynamics, monopolistic control, regulatory capture, public dependency, appear throughout history. Medieval guilds, modern corporate cartels, organized crime syndicates, all employ variations of the tactics pioneered by Rome's bakers. The crisis also serves as a reminder of a fundamental truth. In any society, those who control basic necessities wield extraordinary power. Food, water, shelter, these are not luxuries, they're survival. And when survival becomes a commodity, when it can be hoarded, manipulated, and sold for profit, the entire social order becomes vulnerable. Rome, for all its military might, for all its laws and legions and emperors, learned this the hard way.
The empire conquered nations, built roads across continents, and dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. But it nearly starved because a group of bakers realized they could charge more for bread if they worked together. The bread cartels did not destroy Rome. The empire would survive for another 2 centuries in the West and more than a millennium in the East. But the cartels revealed a crack in the foundation, a vulnerability that would be exploited again and again as the empire aged, as corruption deepened, as the systems that sustained Rome became too complex, too fragile, too easily manipulated by those who understood them.
In the end, the story of Rome's bread cartels is not just a story about bakers. It is a story about power, how it is acquired, how it is hidden, and how it can be wielded by those who seem, on the surface, to be ordinary, harmless, even essential members of society. It is a story about how an empire obsessed with politics, war, and conquest nearly collapsed because it forgot to watch the ovens. And it is a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are not always the ones with swords. Sometimes they are the ones with flour.